Hello, thank you very much for being here. My name is Montse Vendrell. I'm the CEO of BIOCAT, the bioregion of Catalonia. We are the entity that has as a mission promoting biotechnology and biomedicine in Catalonia. It's my honor today to host this table, or to present this table on healthcare new ventures. I have with me today David Very from FLAGSHIP Ventures, Raúl Martín from Ysios Capital, Sander Slootweg from Forbion Capital Partners, Campbell Moray from NOVARTIS Venture Fund, Elisabet de Los Pinos, founder and CEO of Aura Biosciences, and today's moderator will be Laura Barker Morse from Entrepreneurship Ventures. So please welcome with me all the speakers, and we're looking forward to listening to the following debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Montse. That's great. I think actually we're going to give that back. So we just spent a fascinating hour together, and I'm hoping that we can continue the discussion with the audience. Unfortunately, an hour isn't going to give us, and that's all the time we have, give us a chance to have a dialogue with the audience, and I know that many of you will have ideas and questions. And I also asked Montse not to go far, because we came up with some questions about how our discussion impacts the innovation and commercialization of the life sciences that are being done here in Spain. So she's our expert. So if you see me signaling to the front of the auditorium, it's because we have a terrific expert we can call on. So what we're going to do is I'd just like everyone here to once again tell you their names. We don't have it up anywhere where you can refer to it, and just briefly what they do in their day job. Dave, start at your end.
Sure. Hi, I'm David Barry. I'm a partner with Cambridge, Massachusetts-based FLAGSHIP Ventures. We're an early-stage venture capital firm focused on healthcare and clean tech.
Raúl.
My name is Raúl Martín Ruiz. I work for Ysios Capital Partners, that is a venture capital firm based here in Barcelona. We invest in Spain and elsewhere, and we are managing 70 million euro fund just for healthcare.
My name is Sander Slootweg. I work with Forbion Capital Partners. We're a Dutch-based life sciences firm focused on investing in drugs, new drugs, and medical devices. We recently opened an office in Munich, so we're pan-European, and we have about 400 million euros under management.
Hi, I'm Campbell Murray. I work with the NOVARTIS venture funds. We have about 750 million under management and offices in Basel, Switzerland, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. We can invest globally, although our portfolio is heavily weighted towards Europe and the US.
Hello, my name is Elisabet de Los Pinos. I am a Catalan entrepreneur. I started a company 1.5 years ago, and I'm very happy to be here today in my home city. I wanted to thank the sponsors, because they did not only sponsor this Congress, but they sponsored my whole career, both here in Europe and the US. So thank you very much to La Generalitat de Catalunya, and thank you all for being here.
So I think this is a wonderful international panel, and it shows what the trends are in a lot of ways in all the emerging technologies. There are no silos anymore. We've got technology that is bringing people closer together, bringing researchers closer together, and bringing different types of technology closer together. And I'd like to ask Dave Barry to speak a little bit about what trends he's seeing in business, in particular because his firm works very closely at the convergence of engineering and biology in many of their investments, and he personally has invested and invented several key technologies and holds several patents. So what are you seeing as the new things, Dave?
Sure, well, thanks. I think it's funny that people call some of these things the new things, because if you go back to the 70s and 80s when companies like Amgen, Genentech, Biogen, and whatnot were really getting started, a lot of what we're really excited about today is stuff that they proposed in their earliest business plans. These are things like alternative energy strategies, things like making recombinant vaccines, all sorts of things that sit at the interface between biology and engineering. Now, why they didn't do it back then comes from a couple of reasons. First of all, drugs command the highest amount of money per unit volume. So of course you want to go after something like that. But the other thing was the technology was not ready at that point to be able to achieve the goals that you really need to make things like alternative energy and those sorts of concepts a reality. We also didn't have an understanding of the engineering. And so you have schools like MIT that over the past 10 years has formed a department of biological engineering, the first one really to be focused on quantitative biology. You have a equivalent of Moore's law, the law that basically describes how transistors are getting faster and faster, or at least had been, which has started to take place in biology, that our ability to engineer cells now decreases by a factor of 3 every 10 years. Not quite as fast as Moore's law, but still exponential nonetheless. And what you can see is, for example, when penicillin got commercialized, it took 40 years to go from concept to something where it was at maximum productivity. We can now do that in about 5 years. And this has allowed us to really deconstruct the fundamentals of what goes on within a cell, how DNA works, how DNA leads to proteins, how protein networks get formed, how you can regulate the interactions between these sorts of things. And for all intents and purposes, either on a piece of paper or in silico, design what a cell should look like to do a certain function, put in a certain portion of that through methods of engineering like constructive biology, like DNA synthesis, and now have cells that can take in, for example, sugar and spit out petroleum, which is one of our companies, LS9, or in a different way, take in sunlight and CO2 and spit out any chemical that you want just based on designing the specific genes that go in there. We now have the capabilities to engineer these sorts of things and allow us to ask not just the questions of what's financially doable, but just say, what do we want? What are the genes we need? Dial it in and make cells that do that. And this has really become one of the new frontiers that we've been spending quite a bit of our investment time and our innovation efforts on trying to build leading companies in the space.
So there are some very exciting things going on. I think these things are happening in Europe as well as in the halls of MIT. And I know that Sander has worked on some concepts in the area of gene therapy and has some recent experience closer to where we are today.
Well, I think to speak to the theme of how long it takes from the initial idea until a product is sometimes on the market, gene therapy is another area I think that has been a promise for a long time. And just for those of you who do not know what the promise of gene therapy is, of course many diseases have genetic defects at their roots. And of course you can try to manage these diseases by, for instance, providing patients with the protein that they themselves are not making because of a genetic defect. And for instance, companies like Genzyme have built $1 billion franchise around quite rare genetic diseases which they are treating in a sort of a symptomatic relief type of way. But of course, ideally you would like to repair these defects in the cells and install the properly functioning gene. Now, this idea has been around for, say, 15, 20 years, but I think it's only of recent that through technological advancement, and that is in the area of construction of the vector, the carrier that needs to take the gene into the cell where it needs to work, I think there a lot of advancement has been made. At the same time, manufacturing, it was also mentioned, manufacturing technologies until recently were incapable of even producing sufficient quantities of gene therapy product to treat even small, very rare diseases. And I think also in that area we've now seen great advancement. So what we feel at Forbion is that this area, which has been a promise for many, many years, is now, say, where the antibody field was a number of years ago when the first recombinant antibody drugs were introduced into the markets, which are now multi-billion-dollar selling drugs. And just to underpin that with some sort of news from the European and US companies, in Europe there are several companies now in registration studies with gene therapies that could actually, once approved, hit the markets in the next year to 2 years. And so it's no longer science fiction, it's really here, and it's really here to cure very serious diseases like hemophilia, thalassemia, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. All those type of very serious diseases can be treated, can be cured essentially with products that are about to come onto the markets. Also in the context of treating cancers, these technologies have an application. An example there is of a US company currently in registration studies for their drug, which also contains a gene therapy element. And this shows what biotech can do nowadays. Their product is a herpes virus, which is genetically engineered in such a way that it can only selectively replicate in tumor tissue. It can no longer replicate in healthy tissue. So, and also a gene has been built in, or the mechanism has been built in for the cells that are infected with this modified herpes virus to code for a protein that is a very strong attractant of the immune system. So you do not only get a killing effect of the vaccine, but you also get an immunostimulant effect of the gene therapy element here. Now this sounds like science fiction, but this product is actually in a registration study with the FDA as we speak, and I think holds great promise in fighting all sorts of different solid tumor types. So I think we are really at a very exciting age in biotechnology, where through technological advancement, really great life-saving therapies can soon come to market. And that's what has been one of our areas of focus for making investments.
That sounds very promising. I think it's wonderful to have an entrepreneur who's actually using some of the advances in technology. Tell us about how you're using nanotechnology, Ellie.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about nanotechnology because gene therapy is one of the biggest advances, but nanotechnology is going to shape the next 10 years of drug development, at least in some of the areas like oncology. And just to make the audience realize what is nanotechnology, it's usually when we talk about material that it's from 1 to 100 nanometers. And what really is a nanometer, or how can we compare these? And because we are now in the World Cup, it says like a soccer ball compared to the globe, compared to Earth. So we're really talking about the ability of scientists to manipulate materials at a very, very tiny scale. And that has several advantages. It has the advantage that we are using structures that can, for example, deliver drugs in a very specific way. And this has not happened before. Usually the way pharma industry has been doing drugs is by selecting hundreds and hundreds of molecules in a screening process. Now we are shifting the research towards, okay, we have these great molecules, can we make them go to where we want in a rational way? Can we identify tumors by a specific signal and make these particles charged or loaded with these drugs and make them go only where they are needed? This has a lot of impact in obviously a benefit towards the patient, because we're giving drugs that will only go where they are needed. They will not affect other cells. They will not create so many toxic effects. But then also on the healthcare system, because we're treating not only the illness but also the side effects. If we can make drugs that are going to be more effective, we're going to reduce the cost of secondary effects, we're going to reduce the hospitalization of patients, and we're going to make drugs that are very efficient for a stratified population. We're not going to give all the same drugs to everyone, which are going to be, yes, because it's an innovation, they're going to be more expensive, but they're going to be very, very efficient for those patients that are going to receive them. So this is one of the biggest challenges that innovation towards the use of nanotechnology is going to provide to healthcare in the future years.
I think this sounds tremendously exciting. The suggestion that we can use nanotechnology or that we can use some of these advances to personalize medicine are terrific, but Raoul, what do you think? Who's going to be paying for this?
Sorry?
Who will be paying for this? How are we going to afford these things? Are there some models that you think will make these new innovations accessible for us?
Yep. I think that there's a very important point here, and is that, well, these things are very expensive, but there are many cases in which you can demonstrate that there's something beyond price. If you can demonstrate clearly that there will be a final saving for the health authorities, I think that it will be relatively simple to progress with these kind of technologies. I will not be talking about a specific technology. I would like to speak about innovation in general, And I will give you afterwards an example of what I would call an atypical innovation. Because innovation in healthcare, I mean, it's very easy to understand what means innovation in healthcare, but in the past especially, it was when all the molecules, or all the drugs that were used were small molecules, then the antibodies came, and this was a clear innovation because it was representing a new way to treat diseases. Now, something like these nanotechnologies that Eli was mentioning, or something like a small interfering RNA will be also a clear innovation if they finally come to reality. I hope so. But the reality is that in the past it was very easy I would say, to sell this kind of innovations because the companies that were developing this could get high prices for this kind of innovations. Now, I think it's not the same. In the past, there were some words about pharmacoeconomics, but now pharmacoeconomics are really important, and especially in Europe, also starting to be in the US. And now the governments are they are putting a lot of pressure in order to reduce the price of drugs and the cost of the healthcare systems. So now what this might represent is that perhaps investors are not so eager to invest in innovative companies if they are not going to get a return. If those companies are not going to be sold to big pharma companies, and then big pharma companies are going to make a profit on that. So this might be a disincentive for innovation. The thing is that this shouldn't be a problem. I think that there are still many fields in which you can innovate. But I think it's very important to be, as an entrepreneur, to be sure which will be the field of your innovation. So this means that many times people start projects and they think that they are good, and they might be good from the scientific point of view, but then they don't look to the end of the value chain, and perhaps those projects that they are starting will never be interesting for big pharma companies. So I think that it's typically missing a little bit of strategic marketing. That is a concept that in pharma companies is very well established, but it's not established in startups. So, but in any case, I would like to speak about this specific example that I mentioned that is, I would say, atypically innovative. This is a company that we reviewed and we finally invested in recently, together with Forbion, by the way. It's a company developing a drug for a cardiovascular disease. And if you look at the profile of the company, you might think this is not innovative. And why? It's not innovative because, first of all, they are developing a small molecule. A small molecule, okay, I come from the small molecule world, but a small molecule per se is not something innovative. We have now other products that are much more innovative. And on top of that, the molecule is not a new molecule, so it's not something that has been found by HTS, by high throughput screening, and that has been optimized and so on. But it's a molecule that was already existing for a completely different indication. So this is what we call reprofiling or repositioning. Then, on the other hand, the indication that these people are addressing is an indication that currently can be treated only with surgery. So here we have, I would say, an innovative point. So if we consider the cost of surgery, if we consider the risk and complications of surgery, and the amount of money that this means to the healthcare systems, we could think that if this company manages to develop this drug, and at least they achieve a delay, a significant delay in surgery, or they avoid surgery, they will save a lot of money to the healthcare systems, and they could achieve a high price, at least a reasonable price.
So that sounds like a great innovation.
I mean, it's a different way of innovation, but I think that this kind of innovations are now becoming really exciting for venture capitalists because they see a clear exit.
That's great. And of course, Campbell's working both as a venture capitalist and as a corporate venture partner. So he has a unique perspective working in a large company. What are the trends that you're seeing from that 30,000 view, as well as the working with specific individual entrepreneurs?
Well, actually, thanks. It ties in a lot with the comments around me. I guess picking up from Dave first, but focusing where Dave was talking about a lot of the opportunities that we see today and we think are cutting edge were foreshadowed in the business plans of the biotechs in the late 70s and early 80s. I think as I stood back and looked at your question that you posed a few days ago, Laura, when we look at the companies we're most excited about in our portfolio, and we have about 70, and the new investments we're currently working, the drug industry in its history, all of the pharmacopoeia that we use in human medicine hits about 700 targets. Actually, it may be less. Some say as few as 550. And yet, in academia, for the last 20 to 30 years, there's between 3,000 to 4,000 targets, which look very interesting from a biological perspective, which we have cell models for, and the Human Genome Project has suggested will be extremely useful from a clinical perspective. So if you ever get depressed and think that all the low-hanging fruit has been picked and there's nothing left to innovate with, we've only just begun. And the industry, in terms of if you think of the unmet need in human suffering in hospitals and around the world, we really have only started to scratch the surface. And so the trend, when we look at our portfolio, at the companies we're most excited about, it's the companies that are hitting, and this is just the therapeutics, obviously there are devices, diagnostics, vaccines, but among the therapeutic companies, it's the companies that are going after targets that have up until now been considered undruggable. And so this ties in, I think, with the point that was made regards what payers will be prepared to reimburse, and that's when you get highly effective therapy. The problem with small molecules, in some ways, if you get a great small molecule drug, it is the pinnacle of success, because the chances of getting a tiny, simple molecule that is going to be highly specific against a valid target and not cause side effects elsewhere in the body, I mean, it's staggeringly unlikely. And that's why you see today the problems that Big Pharma has, because it's so unlikely that you'll get a small molecule to be a safe and effective medicine.
And therefore have a blockbuster.
And so what we see, exactly, and therefore have a blockbuster. So what we see now, and I think although Big Pharma has been highly resistant, but will come to accept and is accepting now, I've seen it from conversations on the inside, are the new modalities applied to the intractable targets, which tend to be intracellular, because biotech picked off in the 80s the easy-to-hit extracellular targets, which hadn't been hit with small molecules, so with proteins and monoclonal antibodies. So it's things like RNAi, it's things like natural product-like small molecules with diverse scaffolds and structures that traditional chemists could never have manufactured. So I'll give some company examples. So a company, for example, Forma, which came out of Stu Schreiber's technology with diversity-oriented screening. We recently, our fund, have invested in a series of peptide companies which are using novel chemistries, ailerons, using staple peptides to stabilize peptide structures, taking fragments of proteins and getting those fragments inside the protein and providing it with a half-life of 24 hours or even more. And so it's those kinds of technologies that we see coming through. And actually, Ali's company, I'm surprised you didn't promote it, but Aura, so very innovative approach right out of this region, which is taking the viral envelope and using that to deliver payloads in a very targeted fashion inside the cell. So it may be, I mean, one of the problems with RNAi is delivery. And perhaps companies like Ali's may start to allow taking what until now have been useful tool compounds and transforming them into therapeutic products that help people.
I think this is terrific, and I think this audience in particular is interested in how we move these important new developments out of the laboratory and into the marketplace. And I want to come back and have a continuation of our discussion on how we can fund this. But in the meantime, Ellie, tell us a little bit about how you started out and how you're taking your research. What are the key stages that you've crossed so far, and what are the challenges ahead?
Yes, thank you, Laura. So starting is one of the most exciting things because if you think about how much we create versus how much we use of other things that are already there, it's kind of scary. So creating is great, and it's one of the most exciting things I've done after learning. So when you start a company, you think of mainly three things. The first is, well, do I have an innovation that is going to reach the market? And when it reaches the market, it's going to be a market. What's the competition going to look like? And is what I'm doing going to be attractive? The next thing is, who am I going to work with that complements my skills and has done it before? And the third thing is, who's going to finance me? So those three things are the key to start. And then always is the courage. I mean, there's always the fear of failure. And we're all exposed to that. And the easiest is to go and work for CSIC, or the easiest is go and ask for a professorship at the University of Barcelona. That's the most easiest way to follow your academic career. Starting, it's an unknown, especially here in Spain. But if you do it, if you have the courage to do it, you're going to have so much fun, and your professional career is going to be so much enhanced. So I really hope that a lot of people will follow the example, because there's so much good science in this country. I have been with people that have started in academia with me, and they were so much better than I was. And now are at Harvard, they are at UCSF, and I really think that we have a lot of talent in this country. So
the challenge then is how to build these companies. Are there some ideas about how we build these companies in a way that can get funded? We talked a bit about the virtualization, which I think would be worth defining for the group. Dave Campbell, what do you say? Virtualization?
I can start and then hand over. Good. So I think a trend that has really taken, I've only been in venture capital for just under 6 years. And even in that period of time, what has, I think, will maybe save our business is what Laura referred to as virtualization. And essentially, that means the last thing you should want to do at the outset is build an integrated biotech. Meaning you should, if you can, try and get free lab space, and for as little money as possible, prove the null hypothesis of what you're postulating with your technology. So for as little money as possible, come up or design the experiments that will provide as much proof of concept as you can possibly do before you put the product in humans. You don't need to hire a lot of chemists. You don't need to hire a lot of biologists. You don't, the whole value chain right through to having an end-stage drug can now be outsourced. And you can pick the best companies in the world in their particular field to design that part of your product. So you can go to Wuxi for your chemistry in China, and you can go to Lonza in Switzerland, although actually, as long as they treat you as an important client, Ali has a story around that. But you don't need to take the first $10 million that you raise and spend it all on infrastructure that someone else has already done it. It used to be extremely inefficient to outsource in biotech because it was very difficult to define the problem and come up with a contract and a payment structure. But we've now got well beyond that, and it's seamless. People are used to doing it. The venture capitalists love it. I mean, and the other advantage we have is when the team comes back with the results from their data, as a venture capitalist, as an investor, you know that that data was created by an impartial third party. So you can be even more confident in the validity of what you're financing. I think it opens up a world of opportunities. And the most important thing is a lot of investors think about the money they might gain or lose on an investment and the opportunity cost of that money. Well, the people with the greatest opportunity cost are the entrepreneurs themselves, who, as Ali pointed out, have made trade-offs in terms of not pursuing an academic career, or they could be starting another company or in another venture. Virtualization allows them to get an answer very quickly with much less money and know if they're onto a winner.
Yeah, I would say, having spent 10 years as a partner in a venture capital firm, the mantra is the next best thing to yes is a quick no. And similarly, lemons ripen faster than pearls. So if you are not going to succeed or you're not going to get the money, you don't want to spend a lot of time chasing rainbows. But let's talk about some other ways that we can get some funding. Are there large corporate partners available for early stage companies? What are some of the ways that you can offset some of this early cost? Even if you're virtual, you still have a burn rate that's more expensive than, say, building a game company.
So I would like to point out about the grants, because that's the first thing that when you're, especially in Europe, you think, okay, so I need 1 million, I probably have 500K through grants. And I really want to emphasize people who look for grants and people who have the money to give the grants to really look at the trends of biotech and see these business models. Because when I was starting, I was thinking, where do I start, right? I can start in Europe or I can start in the US, and where are the pros, cons, and both are good. But one of the things that was really challenging is that Europe offers great grant opportunities, but they have a limitation on the business model. So they want the entrepreneur to hire as many postdocs and scientists as possible. And that's exactly what you shouldn't do. You should outsource as much as possible and be cash efficient so that you have your proof of principle with less money. And so that's a real conflict, because in order to get the grant, you have to hire people. And you don't want to do that because you want to have the proof of concept with a minimal cash burn. So I would really, really emphasize that, yes, it's a cut-through. You want the money, but you want the freedom to run your company in the most efficient way. And maybe that's, not going through the grant opportunity. I didn't go for the grant opportunity. I thought that was a big limitation for the company and the business model. So I went through business angels, and I was very, very lucky to get money through business angels. And there are great business angels groups in Europe that you can have access to. They have expertise in pharma. They're usually successful pharma entrepreneurs that built their companies in the 70s and now want to help some new biotech models and biotech entrepreneurs. So you should knock on the door and pitch your business to those.
So I think we're all great believers in having stories about entrepreneurs, and Ellie's story is still unfolding. I'm sure you'll all want to follow how it develops. Thinking about other sources of money other than government money or venture capital, Dave, are you seeing today that you're getting early or maybe preclinical companies funded by pharma? Are there some trends that might be hopeful in that direction? Because in the past, large pharma wanted to see something that was a sure thing before they'd commit.
Sure. So the short answer, yes. The longer answer is, in the way that we think about company building, that is absolutely central to the way we think about what we're going to invest in and the way that we try to bring in money. It costs way more money to develop a drug and get into the clinic than any venture capitalist, frankly, at least that I know.
So give us a number.
100 million, more than that, much more than any of them want to put in. If you go back to the year 2000, you'll see some companies that came out around then that did raise that much money. That's much more the exception in this day and age. We have a company called Ysios that very recently closed I think what's been called a blockbuster deal in the space by getting $130 million up front and $120 million for milestones from Celgene for each target that they go forward with over the next 3 years. There's been another company that did a $1.4 billion deal earlier this year. And in short, to an extent, the big biobucks deal, even at a preclinical stage, which both of these companies are, is back. When we look at therapeutic companies that we want to invest in, frankly, if pharma is not expressing active interest, it falls off our radar screen very, very quickly. I do want to echo one thing that Campbell said a bit earlier, which is a little bit of the entrepreneur's dilemma, and it plays out quite a bit when you start dealing with pharma. An entrepreneur is fundamentally incented to say yes and want to make things fundamentally work. And not that I would accuse anyone of having a natural bias, but it either works or you don't have a job. And that thinking gets into every entrepreneur's head at some point. The beauty of doing these big deals is, one, they bring in money. Two, they don't take all that much of the company from you. They affect more of the numerator than the denominator of of the company, but it's much less dilutive than, say, venture equity. And then in the same way that a third party who does work for you gives you comfort in the data, the fact that a large pharma or a large company, even in any other industry, would want to put their stamp on it in a public way gives tremendous value. I'll just add one other comment in that governments now are starting to play a very large role, and I'm not talking about in traditional grants, but they're starting to do $10 million, $100 million, $1 billion land grants, manufacturing grants, things along those lines that can massively reduce the cost of capital as well. So there's tons of opportunities out there these days.
Are you seeing that in Europe, Sander? Government grants to...
Well, I think in Europe, of course, the picture is more scattered, so it really depends from one country to the next. But I would say there are some interesting models evolving where the government is actively trying to help bridge this gap, where especially the very early stage companies still need to show proof of principle, where they need to get the money, and they typically don't get it from VCs, because VCs they can pick from the whole spectrum from early stage to late stage, and so given the relatively long cycles in biotech, they tend to go for the more late stage typically. But to give a couple of examples, for instance, in France, there are different tax-driven schemes where people can pay, for instance, their wealth tax by investing into typical venture capital type of companies that are managed typically by the larger captive groups of large
And how long
French
has that
banks.
scheme been in place?
That's been well. This particular scheme for a short while, but there was another scheme already for many years in place where people could also pay certain parts of their taxes by investing into these funds. So in France, you face a situation that there's actually more money around than there are good quality companies to fund. So some of these French funds, as you now have unified legislation throughout Europe in this regard, they can also invest in other EU countries in early stage companies. So there is a bit of a spillover effect from the French regulations. In the Netherlands, for instance, the government put a scheme in place where they actually lend money to small venture capital funds. And this money goes in the form of leverage, which means that if the fund does not do well, that the government essentially loses its money. And if the fund does do well, then they take a relatively small portion of the profits of the fund. So in both scenarios, it really acts as leverage. And that makes the risk-reward profile for private investors much more attractive to go into early stage, because these small funds are really focused on early stage.
So that's a good
companies.
example of the public-private collaboration that was talked about yesterday as well. So are there any European companies that are doing the same thing Celgene did for your portfolio company? Do you know of any, Raoul or Campbell?
Well, I can give one example. A company in our portfolio called Santaris Pharma. They also have a broad platform technology that can be used, for instance, to address these intracellular targets, as mentioned before. And of course, given that it's a broad platform technology, they can develop many different types of binders that can do this trick, many more than they could develop themselves. So that's an excellent platform that you can leverage at an early stage in closing deals with the pharmaceutical industry that may have 1 or 3 or 4 targets of particular interest where they have had difficulties to develop drugs against. And so in the case of Santaris, they were able to do several quite substantial deals, also in the order of magnitude of, say, 700 million euros, with significant upfront, significant milestone payments. And that has really alleviated a lot of the pressure from the investors that otherwise would have to put this money in as investment capital.
So how do we educate not just the high net worth individuals, but the public in general about some of these changes? We are seeing, we all said that it was quite noteworthy, newsworthy, but maybe not life-changing that Craig Ventner's lab has now synthesized a gene. But this also brings up, how does the science community work with government or work with education to make sure that the public at large not only is aware of investment opportunities, but aware of what is possible in the future? Because this is basically, at the end of the day, how we're going to have governments that are receptive to innovation. And Dave, you were talking about an example of an innovation that hasn't been widely accepted. How do we get these messages across? I think the story about your transplant company was a fascinating one.
First and foremost is I think it's everyone's responsibility to make sure that the messages ultimately, that they ultimately get across. It turns out government, of course, responds in a completely backwards thinking way because they don't know where the innovation is coming from. Their job is not to innovate, it's to respond. And what we've seen is that they're very open to dialogues with entrepreneurs, with investors, with whatever it happens to be. We happen to be in Capitol Hill in the US on probably a weekly or bi-weekly basis trying to educate people. The example that Laura was referring to is we have a company where this is exactly the problem, but it's sort of, in a way, it almost feels like one of these no-brainer sorts of things. So this company is called Transmedics. It's actually primarily works in Europe and is moving into the US at this point. What it does is it basically takes an organ that you're trying to transplant. They focused on the heart to start and are moving into the lung at this point. When you take it out of the first body, instead of putting it in what the current technology is, which is literally a box of ice, nothing more advanced than that, they put it on this fancy thing that now oxygenates it, prevents it from dying, and they can also tell if the organ is going to work or if, when you put it into the new person, if it's just going to plop dead and, of course, as a result, make the patient do the same thing. And despite the fact that this is a company that's been well populated with every single key opinion leader that exists in Europe and every single one that exists in the US, there's been trepidation about doing this. And the reason, frankly, the best we can tell is that people are adverse to change more than anything else. They want it proven out before they adapt into a new thing. But frankly, I think it's more that there is a lack of understanding of what's actually happening. As a slightly different take on this, Laura mentioned Craig Venter's stunt, where effectively the way I like to describe it is if you're trying to build
a stunt. You called it a stunt? Okay.
Very much
just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly.
Yes. Okay. Is basically taking a paper that was done in 1983, but instead of doing it in a simple and direct way, the analogy is you take a car engine out, you break it apart, and then you blindfold yourself, you put your hand over like this, you put your leg off to the side, and you build the same engine again, you put it back in the car, and you say that it runs. And I think any of us would say, whoop-de-doo, we spent a lot more money and we did the same thing that already exists. The problem is there's a lack of understanding. I've had the fortune to talk with staff in the White House very recently about this, and fortunately they get that. The problem which I think exists for this whole field is people are alarmed by the risks that are associated with genetic modification. And one of the things that we've spent quite a bit of our time educating people on is the notion of how do you put security into things. And that represents a couple of things. How do you prevent modified DNA cells, organisms, things along those lines from escaping? How do you prevent things from having untoward effects? And frankly, if you're dealing with fuel technologies or agricultural technologies, how do you prevent people from stealing it? We have a lot of effort, a lot of money that's gone into that space, and have spent a lot of time educating that. And we're seeing the future of synthetic biotechnology really migrating to that of security.
So what do we think, Roel? In Europe, is it more difficult for people to embrace the idea of genetically modified industrial products or healthcare products?
Well, I think that in Europe, in general, I don't know in the US because perhaps I should speak with you before. But in Europe, typically people they don't know the implications of what means a genetically modified animal or a species or whatever. So I think that there should be a lot of education made in this field in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's good. So as we think about some of the challenges that are facing entrepreneurs in biotech, Campbell, what would you say the biggest challenge is now for someone thinking of starting? And is it the economy? Is it the lack of funding? What are the big challenges for starting and building a successful life sciences company? And you can include devices as well.
I think it's getting funded. We referenced this yesterday briefly in terms of building syndicates right now is tough. And there's really an ecosystem issue, so it's, entrepreneurs shouldn't take it personally. A lot of the number of venture funds that have that raised financing or new funds in 2008 was a third of the previous year. It came back up last year to about a half. but it's still at a 50% level at what it was before the financial crisis hit the United States and then spread globally. There's also, at the same time, a wider issue for big pharma that is feeding back down through the venture funds and then through early stage companies. And the issue big pharma faces, while there are a couple of things going on. They're cash flow rich, meaning that they continue to, as companies, generate a lot of free cash flow even after the debt's paid. But if you look across all of the big pharmas, Roche, Genentech, Pfizer, Wyeth, Novartis, Alcon, Merck, Schering, of the top 10, 80–90% have just done a major merger and are going through large integration issues. And in fact, they're in the odd situation this year of having extremely negative balance sheets, which is very unusual for big pharma. They don't like that. They like to have a lot of cash in case of the Merck-Vioxx situation, or in a sense, an analogy to what's just happened to BP, where something catastrophic happens to one of their lead products and they have to cover themselves through what could be an existential threat for the wider organization. Beyond that, the other issue that is putting pressure on big pharma, well, they're going to go from roughly losing as an industry about $50 billion per year of patented products. In the next 5 years, it's going to be about around 100 to 200 billion of patented products going off patent. So they have an enormous issue coming up beginning 2011 through to 2016 where the industry as a whole is going to shrink, and yet they have an odd situation in their development pipelines where they have very limited bandwidth to take on new projects, meaning that when they acquire a venture-backed company, they have to kill a baby inside. They have to take one of their own phase 2 or phase 3 programs and shut it. And that is extremely difficult for organizations to do and creates major barriers to entry for their business development colleagues. So it's kind of the perfect storm right now. On the bright, for the VCs and the late stage venture companies, and that is forcing the VCs to be much more risk conservative and prepare to fund their current portfolio companies for longer and even do the unthinkable, and some of them are even having to fund through NDAs right now. That can be a happy story. I can give you a couple examples last year where the VCs actually had great exits after funding through an NDA, but it's the last thing you really want to do as an investor. On the bright side, the fact that the big pharma companies have so many major products coming off patent is going to put, it's going to be a bonanza, I think, once we get through the next few years. There will have been much fewer early stage companies and concepts backed because of the financial conditions. And for those investors and entrepreneurs that have been successful in raising and have successful technologies, I think you're going to find a pharma industry that's extremely receptive and looking forward to growth again, and probably public markets that are willing to support them again. And even possibly a healthcare system which is willing globally, Europe and the United States, to reward innovation. So I think the future's bright, but right now it's tough.
You know, we had a brief exchange that the FDA approach right now is fairly risk averse, and that is also impacting, from what you all said, some of the new areas for research investment. Does anybody have an observation about how regulation impacts the commercialization of new technology?
I can comment on that too. I mean, you've made a point. It's another thing making it tough for pharma and even for venture. And I should hand over to colleagues, especially Dave, I think had thoughts on this. But just very quickly, I think the perfect example is another corporate fund, Novo Ventures, which is the venture arm of Novo Nordisk Pharmaceuticals, a leading insulin manufacturer based in Europe. And Novo Ventures will no longer invest in diabetes entrepreneurial companies, diabetes venture-backed companies. They won't do it not because the unmet need's not large or the market opportunity's not enormous. It's all of those things. They won't do it because the FDA now is requiring such strenuous safety studies in phase 3, their level of risk aversion is so high, and the burden of proof and the endpoints, that they'll accept, it's no longer good enough just to show you lower insulin. What does that mean? Lower glucose. What does that mean? And the size of the trials and the cost of the trials scares even big pharma. I mean, osteoporosis and other lifestyle illnesses. So as a result, you're seeing a real inhibition, even when the market opportunity is enormous. So as an entrepreneur, you may be standing in front of the VCs wondering why they don't get it. You're showing them a $12 billion market opportunity, and they're scared. And they're scared because they don't know how to finance it to a point where they get an exit.
So are we seeing the same trend in Europe? Because Dave mentioned that his company has first gone through approval in Europe, and I think, Ellie, you've had some experience with choosing where you will enter the market first. Is it easier here?
From the experience that I had when I was working at Lilly, it's always easier to start clinical trials in Europe and then move to the US. That's a trend that, that it might change or not, but certainly there are certain opportunities in Europe for clinical development that can allow you to be much cost efficient developing your drug. And I have an example. I was talking to the CEO of Digna Biotech, which is a great Spanish company, a biotech company. And he was telling me that he was doing a phase 2 clinical trial at the clinical hospital of Navarra in Pamplona. And the cost of that was $400K. I was like, that's impossible. It's not possible that a randomized phase 2 costs $400K. I said, yes, I mean, you have to choose very clearly who's your principal
So by comparison, what would the cost be in the US?
Well, it would be, I guess, the comparison is even ridiculous because it would be over 10 million, right, until you get to the phase 2.
Anybody disagree with that number? Okay, that's a pretty remarkable contrast.
So you have to choose the hospital, you have to choose very well and make sure that the PI is reliable, that there are certainly opportunities.
Sorry, PI?
The principal investigator of the clinical trial. But certainly there are opportunities. Belgium is another of the countries that it's usually very open to doing clinical trials with a less time on regulation to start the first patient enrolled. So yeah, certainly I think that Europe offers a possibility there.
That's really good. I think we're coming down to where I'd like to have each of you just give us a thought about what is a message that would help the global development of these very exciting research trends that we're seeing. What can we do to help the commercialization? What are some ideas that we'd like people to take away and share with their constituents, maybe with the people they vote for, lobby for if they're really active? What are some things we think would be good for the life science industry and good for global health? Raul, do you have something you'd like to see have happen in the next couple of years, just in a minute or so?
Yes. Well, what I would like the message that I would like to convey to entrepreneurs in general, after having seen many in these 2 years that I've been in venture capital, is that, I mean, it's very, very important that when they are starting a new venture, they really identify a clear unmet medical need, or at least a very smart way of improving something that already exists, okay? So for instance here, you can think about the brain, about delivering drugs to the brain. The brain sometimes is a problem because it has the blood-brain barrier, and many drugs that could be very, very good, they cannot be developed because they just don't cross the blood-brain barrier. So now there are a number of companies that are working on systems to try to make these drugs to cross the blood-brain barrier. And given the fact that there has been a lot of research around CNS, I think that could be, for instance, a good example of how to try to be innovative. And
so an area that we should really encourage some more support, because it could have a huge impact on the population, health of the population. Senator, how about you? What do you think are some things you'd like to see?
Well, it's already been mentioned a couple of times that for certain indications, it's very difficult as a venture-backed firm to really get your product to the market, or even to a stage where big pharma that can choose between many different products nowadays, where they are interested to take on the rest of the risk of the development. So I think one area that is quite interesting for both entrepreneurs and for VCs like us to consider is the so-called orphan drug space, where for rarer diseases you get accelerated approval possibilities to get your product on the market with fewer patients than would be normally required. You get sort of market exclusivity, and that applies both to the US and to Europe, on your drug, your mechanism of action. And in some cases, actually with private capital, you can then take a drug from early discovery all the way to the market, which makes you less dependent on A, partnering, and B, on the public markets, which normally at some point in time you need to access in order to get your product closer to the market.
Yeah, that certainly worked for Genzyme and some other companies that have built on that first product. Ellie, how about you? What's your dream?
The acceptance of newer technologies by the physicians is a dream, right? We work so hard from the basic science in molecular biology. We know all these new targets. Pharma companies trying to achieve these new targets. We bring a great innovation, and once we are there and we've crossed the NDA, and then it reaches the physician, and it again comes to education, but the acceptance of innovation from the physician is something that is a barrier to innovation itself. So we had
a statistic that it takes up to 17 years
well,
for
we were discussing, if it takes 17 years, I mean, it's something that from medical school to, we should put maybe these startups pitching to medical school students to see it. It was very interesting because Harvard asked me to pitch the new school of bioengineering, which is a new thing, bioengineering. And I was talking to the students and just telling them with an image of Richard Branson on my back, saying, well, if he's able to drive a balloon, I mean, we should take some risks here, right? And the students were like amazed because they see like these innovations coming from the lab that is just beside their room, and then the acceptance when they become a medical doctor and see this new technology that is in their hands now to treat patients. I think that barrier will be overcome. So that's my dream.
So we think of doctors as knowing everything, but in fact they need continuing education about innovation. Dave, how about you? Parting thoughts?
Sure. So I think the fundamental thing one has to remember is the role of an entrepreneur is to fundamentally innovate. People become entrepreneurs because they want to ultimately change the system. And that goes to everything. Basically, you'll go around, you'll talk to 100,000 people, and 99.9999% of them will tell you your idea is wrong, and you'll be convinced that you have the right thing. For all entrepreneurs, as a rule of thumb, that has to, your modus operandi has to be, why am I right? Why am I driving forward? And let me figure out how I'm going to take my game-changing innovation and change the world. And what that means is you hear a lot of venture capitalists, even myself, saying why you have to partner with us and all of that. You have to take a step back and actually ask, what is the right way for me to build my company? How do I get the lowest cost of capital? How do I build the company the fastest way? Venture capital is, in fact, a dying industry. We've cut the number of firms by more than 50% over the last, actually almost 75% over the last 10 years alone. So that may not be the right answer. So as you go through each step of your process, you have to ask that question of how do I best build that company? And then how can I grow it to meet those global needs?
Great. Campbell, how about you?
Tough act to follow. I'd like to combine Dave and Sanders' comments. And Sanders, I think you're absolutely right about picking an orphan disease. So for those of you who might pursue a therapeutic company, I think you can go after diabetes, you can go after osteoporosis, you can go after those mega market opportunities. But the way to do it is, as Sanders said, and I just want to emphasize that, when someone says the orphan disease strategy, it's not just Genzyme, a market of 17 people globally. What it is picking early at the phase 1 point a pure play biological example of the mechanism that you're targeting, and take that disease area as your first proof of concept in humans, knowing that the same mechanism may apply in polymechanistic or polygenetic diseases, which are very complex and which will require large studies to prove later. And I think it's an excellent point made by Sanders. And that is a way that you can walk the tightrope of the extremely risk-averse FDA and the needs of yourself as an entrepreneur and investors to get a product to market to help patients quickly.
I think that's terrific. And I want to note that this is an extremely well-educated group with more than 90 years of graduate training. But I think they met my requirement of making their level of expertise accessible to everybody, for those of us who do not have MDs or PhDs. And thank you so much for joining us at HIT this year. This has been great fun for me. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.